Hello and welcome to the second review of Requests Month 2018. Today I'm taking a look at Age of Mythology, along with its expansion pack, The Titans, and its additional expansion pack that was released for the extended edition later on, called Tale of the Dragon. What I'll be showing here is Extended Edition, which is just much more compatible with modern systems than the older version of the game, even though the older version works just fine. It's one of those things where I'd rather be able to show you a game in 1080p than have to scale it from a 4:3 resolution. This means that the version of the game I'm playing here was PC exclusive, but the original release of the game with the original expansion was both PC and Mac. Now with that information out of the way, let's go ahead and actually talk about the game itself. This is a real-time strategy game developed by Ensemble Studios and published by Microsoft Game Studios in 2002 for PC and Mac, and it later saw a re-release as the Extended Edition on Steam in 2014. The main features of the Extended Edition include support for native widescreen resolutions that are more modern, whereas the original game was only in 4:3 resolutions, as well as Steamworks integration, some Twitch support so you could actually stream the game through Twitch without much fuss, as well as some improved water and lighting effects, and the big thing being that with the Steamworks integration, it also came with Steam-based multiplayer, as opposed to the original game, which had Ensemble Studios Online, which is no longer available, really. Now, if you did already have an ESO account, you could just log into it and play the original version of the game online if you wanted to, and you can do the same thing with Age of Empires 3. But if, for example, your friend just picked up a new copy of the original game, or they picked up a used copy somewhere and they want to play online with you, they're either going to have to do it through direct connection or through LAN play. Obviously, the Extended Edition on Steam removes that problem entirely because you can just hop in the game and whoever has a Steam account and already has the game can play with you without any problems. But I'm really not that concerned with all of the differences between the Extended Edition and the original release, because the Extended Edition is what is easily available to just about anybody these days, and with the exception of the Tales of the Dragon expansion, it doesn't really do all that much to affect the actual quality of the game, so it's not really going to factor into this review very much. Obviously, it will factor in a bit more when I get to the Tales of the Dragon expansion, but for now, just understand that Extended Edition is the version that's readily available right now, and it comes with a lot of convenience features that the original game didn't necessarily have. With that said, I do also have to get one major caveat out of the way. Those of you who've watched my videos for a while probably already know this, but Age of Empires 2 is actually my favorite real-time strategy game of all time. To this day, I can still hop into Age of Empires 2 and play it to my heart's content and never get tired of it, even though I have put hundreds upon hundreds of hours into that game. So let me walk you through the process of what it felt like to both learn about Age of Mythology and then to eventually play it. When I first heard about the game, I was like, holy crap, that is awesome, because not only am I interested in history, I'm also interested in mythology. And a combination of ancient Greek, ancient Egyptian, and Norse mythology in a real-time strategy game where they're all going up against each other sounds incredibly cool. On top of that, it's by the same developer as Age of Empires 2, which again is my favorite real-time strategy game of all time, so why wouldn't I be excited for it? Especially considering that it was receiving extremely good reviews across the board, both from mainstream press and even Age of Empires fans who absolutely loved the thing. So right from the get-go, I was pretty much of the mindset of, I have to get this game and see what it's like for myself. So I did. And what ensued was one of the biggest disappointments of my entire gaming career. I want to make this abundantly clear going into this review. Regardless of whether or not it is actually a good quality RTS, which I will assess in this video, I hate this game. It is one of those games where every single time I try to play it, I always stop playing it within a few minutes. Simply because those few minutes make me so miserable when I'm actually playing it that I want to do quite literally anything else. And the worst part is, I know that is entirely on me. It has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the game, which again, I will talk about in the video. It is my personal preference absolutely destroying this game for me. But you know what the funny part is? Despite what a lot of people will tell you, I can actually put that aside and assess the game for what it is. So let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, why it makes me hate it so much, and whether or not it's actually a good game despite that. Well, as far as presentation goes, it was never really all that impressive to begin with, but it did have a lot of attention to detail and a lot of polish. So even though you are dealing with some fairly blocky models and some pretty low-res textures, you do have a fair amount of detail in the animations, particularly with things like the myth units, some of which are capable of picking up other units and actually throwing them around or eating them if they're one of the man-eating plants or something along those lines, and that sort of thing is actually pretty cool. It really does add quite a lot of charm to the game, and that's something that Ensemble has really been known for a very long time. They throw in a bunch of silly cheat codes and silly taunts and things like that to give their games a bit of spice that other games don't have, and this one is no exception there. And for 2002, the visuals were pretty solid to boot, so that really did help. Now, the extended edition definitely looks a bit dated because it is just bringing the original graphics up to higher resolutions, but given that this is a real-time strategy game, it's pretty easy to forgive that, especially considering the original game's release was in 2002. Plus, it's just nice to be able to play this in modern resolutions instead of having to go back to an old 4x3 resolution like 1280 by 1024, for example. Plus, the extended edition also brings better lighting to the table as well as considerably better water effects, so those are definitely quite nice to have. Now, as far as aesthetics go, in addition to the detail that they put into unit animations and such like that, they also have every single faction looking very unique. Even the Atlanteans, which they introduced in the Titans expansion, still look distinct from the Greeks they're clearly based on, so they actually did a very good job with that. But then there's the Chinese faction, which they introduced in the Tale of the Dragon expansion, which was only available for extended edition. And it is painfully obvious that they are just a mishmash of various units that were already in the original game and the Titans expansion. This has led many people to just completely dismiss the Chinese faction as a reskin, and as far as visuals go, they're not entirely wrong there. They do still have their own look, it's just obvious that a lot of assets were reused from the previous game and the expansion pack, and not a lot of this stuff is actually original. And unfortunately, the completely original visuals that they did put into the new expansion, Tale of the Dragon, are really not very good. In fact, they're of a considerably lower quality standard than the base game or the Titans expansion. And as if that weren't bad enough, there's also graphics glitches in the cutscenes, which just makes it look pretty unprofessional. Especially considering that those graphics glitches have been there since the beginning of that particular expansion and have never been fixed. This means that the Tale of the Dragon expansion is very conspicuous in its considerably lower quality than the base game and its original expansion pack. And unfortunately, that problem extends to the sound design as well, which in the base game and the original expansion pack was generally very well done. The voice acting was cheesy, sure, but it got the job done, and it got it done pretty well. But when you get to the Tale of the Dragon expansion, a lot of it's just kind of cringe-inducing. I mean, look, I get that this is a real-time strategy game, and the voice acting's probably not going to be the best, but where the original game and its expansion had a kind of cheesy charm about them, when you get to Tale of the Dragon, it just comes across as cheap. I mean, they even put on some pretty fakey Chinese accents, and it just does not sound good at all. Luckily, that's only really a problem in the cutscenes, because in the normal course of play, when you're commanding units around, they don't speak English, so it doesn't really come across as an issue. Then you move over into sound effects, and you find that they just get the job done, and there's really nothing more to them than that. That's something that's pretty standard for most real-time strategy games, really. But then there's the music, which is very well done, and definitely reminiscent of what you would have heard in Age of Empires 1 or 2, but it doesn't have the same lasting impact that those two games had. I still find myself humming various tunes from Age of Empires 1 and 2 all the time, but when it comes to Age of Mythology, there's really only 1 or 2 songs in the entire game that are actually all that memorable. That's of course not to say the music's bad. As I mentioned before, it's quite good and gets the job done. It's just that it's not as memorable as Age of Empires 1 or 2. And luckily, as far as presentation goes, music's one thing they didn't really skimp on with the Tale of the Dragon expansion. That's not to say that the music in the expansion's amazing or anything, but it's definitely solid enough, and it fits in well with the theme. So at least they did that better than they did the visuals and the rest of the sound for that particular expansion. But presentation is only part of the equation, and really not even the most important part of it. What really matter are the story and the gameplay. And it's worth noting that in Age of Empires 1 and 2, you had a selection of several different campaigns that you could go through, each of which was historically based. This is not the case with Age of Mythology. Instead, you have a storyline featuring the exploits of the Atlantean hero Arkantos, where the game starts off with him basically trying to go off and fight during the Trojan War, and things get more and more complicated until eventually Arkantos is going up against forces that are trying to awaken the Titans, these beings that originally ruled the Earth until Zeus came along and imprisoned them in the abyss known as Tartarus, and now there's a plot to basically awaken them and break them out of their prison so they can wreak havoc upon the world once again, and eventually lead to new leadership in Olympus. Now, in theory, it has all of the elements that would make an interesting story, but unfortunately, they try to shoehorn too many of the mythologies in. And by that, I mean they shoehorn all of the mythologies in, the Greek, Egyptian, and Norse, and they all interact like it's the most normal thing in the universe. There's absolutely no effort made to actually integrate all of these mythologies together to try to explain why they're interacting. It's just done, and they decided that it was perfectly fine as is. It's not really the case. I mean, you can easily make it make sense for multiplayer because it's a video game, and obviously in multiplayer storyline doesn't really matter, but in single player, they really do need an explanation for all of this, and there really isn't one. And on top of that, they try to shoehorn too many mythological characters in, for example, Ajax and Odysseus, and they just end up coming across as contrived more than anything else. This ultimately means that instead of the story being interesting and unique, it just ends up coming across as bad fanfiction, and while it wouldn't necessarily be a problem, unfortunately there is only one campaign in the original Age of Mythology. If they had individual campaigns for the Greek, Egyptian, and Norse, then I feel like that would work a hell of a lot better than what they have set up here, which just shoehorns them in without much rhyme or reason. That said, as far as it actually being an RTS campaign goes, they did a good job with keeping the objectives varied and the scenarios varied enough to keep your interest. So even though the story itself is something of a mess, actually playing the campaign isn't really a problem because you can at least get wrapped up in the scenarios and the different challenges they pose. This leads me into something that is much more important than the actual story in this game, which is how the actual gameplay is set up. There are 3 factions to choose from in the base game. Those are Greece, Egypt, and the Norse. And when you actually choose them, at least in the random map or skirmish mode, if you prefer to call it that way, you have a selection of major gods for each faction, each of which has its own set of lesser gods that will give you different bonuses as you age up. As you advance through the ages, you get access to new units and new buildings, as well as new technologies in order to improve the capabilities of your units, as well as your gather rates and such like that. This means that at its core, it is quite similar to Age of Empires 1 and 2, with some pretty major changes. First off being the selection of lesser gods that you can pick when you actually go up to a new age. You're given a selection between 2 of them, and they will give you different bonuses depending on which one you pick. So let's say you have enough resources and you decide to age up. Well, it's going to give you a selection between, let's just say, one that will give you a lot of bonuses towards cavalry, and another one that will give you a lot of bonuses towards myth units. You're free to pick either one depending on what playstyle you're going for, and that means that there is quite a bit of variety with how you can actually set up the various civilizations in order to succeed. Once you've selected your pantheon, you are dropped into the game, and you have to go through a pretty standard arrangement for a base building real-time strategy game. You send your gatherers to collect resources, those being food, wood, and gold, and there's also an additional resource called favor, which is generated differently depending on which faction you're playing. The Greeks send villagers to pray at temples, whereas the Egyptians build monuments that give you a gradual trickle of favor, and the Norse generate favor based on fighting. Favor is used to either purchase myth units or to purchase the various technologies that the lesser gods give you when you age up. The myth units you have available will change depending on which lesser gods you pick, so you do need to keep in mind what you're setting up as you go through the game so you end up with a strong lineup of myth units. This is because if you've played Age of Empires, then you will find yourself very confused by the fact that myth units are the only kind of universal unit in the entire game. You see, instead of using a soft counter system where one particular unit type may be especially good against another unit type, but is still decent all around, like in, say, Age of Empires 2, where, for example, you could take a swordsman and they would be useful against a wide variety of enemies, but they're especially good at attacking buildings, or cavalry, where it was pretty good against pretty much everything in the game except for spearmen, which it had a weakness to. Age of Mythology operates on a hard counter system. Every single unit type has exactly 1 or 2 things it is good against, and nothing more. If you use it against anything else, it is practically useless. And it works like this. Infantry is good against cavalry. Archers are good against infantry. Cavalry is good against archers. All of them are weak against myth units, and the only counter to myth units is heroes. Then of course there are siege weapons and naval ships, both of which are pretty much in their own categories and don't really interact with any of the other ones. There are of course a few exceptions here, but you can just say that generally speaking the siege weapons and the naval ships are outliers to that whole formula. Now within these various categories there are also specific counter units. So for example, there are some infantry units that are counter infantry, as in they're infantry units that are only good against other infantry. If you use them against anything else, they are effectively useless. But even the basic unit types tend to have that problem as well. So for example, if you send infantry that is good against cavalry up against other infantry that is good against cavalry, then you're going to notice the health bars depleting very slowly because those unit types aren't good against each other, therefore you don't use them against each other. Duh! I want to make it abundantly clear that this is the biggest gameplay reason I can't stand this game. I absolutely hate when I have an army set up and they're effectively worthless, because the only thing I'm going up against is something that is not what they're specifically good against. Soft counter systems aren't a problem because at least the unit has versatility. You can actually use it as opposed to having to sit there and be like, okay, what am I fighting against? Okay, well, I'll train the counter units to whatever they're sending at me. That is the reality of having a hard counter system in your game. Instead of actually encouraging you to build a variety of units, you're just going to build whatever the exact counter is to whatever enemies are sending at you. Which realistically are only going to be a handful of unit types, most of them probably being myth units because myth units are good against all human units. And the direct counters to those are heroes, which you don't really get all that many of. Now, of course, you can offset the unit countering problem by having a particularly large army, but that takes a while to build up, and even if you do have a particularly large force, it's still very inefficient because whatever units countering whatever you've got in your mosh pit of units are still going to wreak havoc on your army and eventually whittle it down. This ultimately means that the game can turn into a very tedious slog, which is really unfortunate because, again, when you have such charm as some of the myth units do, where they'll pick people up and throw them around, or they'll smack somebody across the map or something along those lines, and that sort of thing gets incredibly amusing, but because of the unit balancing, it just becomes tedious. They try to spice some things up by giving you various god powers that you unlock as you age up, as well as depending on which major god you pick, but you can only use those a very limited number of times per match, so even though they are definitely very amusing, you unfortunately don't get much of a chance to play with them. This means that ultimately, even though you do have those powers available to you, you have to use your units almost all the time, which means you're probably going to try to rely on myth units, but then you find out that there's a particularly nasty problem with them. They take up an awful lot of slots in your population count, which means that if you build up a lot of myth units, you're going to have really not all that many units, but your population count's going to be full. So you may think, oh, well, I'll have a variety of units. I'll have some infantry, I'll have some cavalry, and I'll have some archers along with the main myth units. Well, guess what? All of the military units take up 2 population slots or more. This makes the population counter especially annoying for this particular game. It's not really a problem in previous Age of Empires games because they were very consistent with how they did things. If you built a military unit or just a unit in general, unless it was, say, a siege weapon, generally speaking, it only took up 1 population slot. Here, most of the human military units take up 2 population slots, most of the villagers, although not all, take up 1 population slot, and then the myth units take up a wide variety of population slots. And then of course you have siege weapons, ships, and heroes on top of that, each taking up a different number of population slots, and it just gets irritating to deal with after a while. Because unlike in previous Age of Empires games where you could just keep building houses until you got to the population cap, you can't do that here. Instead, it will limit you on the number of houses you can build. And if you want to increase your population cap any further after you built the maximum number of houses, you have to go around and build town centers. This may not seem like much of a problem, except that you can now only build town centers on settlements. This means that instead of being able to strategically build town centers in order to maximize your resource production, you have to build them on wherever the game says you can build them, which is generally not a particularly well optimized location. It's in the middle of a clearing and there's not really much around it. This means that most likely you're not going to be deciding to place a town center based on any real strategy. You're probably only going to be deciding to place it because you need more population count. It comes across as an element that they thought was a good idea, but they just didn't really know how to implement, so they just did what they could, and the end result was something that's a bit of a mess. Speaking of a bit of a mess, when the game originally launched, there were only 3 civilizations, and they were not very well balanced at all. In fact, they're still not very well balanced. The Norse are especially weak, which is why pretty much nobody plays them online. They always stick to Greece or Egypt. And if you go in and try to play the game as the Norse, then you very quickly understand why. It's because their units are not particularly great, and they have some weird oddities with the way they collect resources and build buildings. Namely, they have 2 gatherer units, and neither of those can build buildings. All they can do is collect resources. They have their basic human gatherers, and then they have the dwarves, which are particularly good at mining gold. And again, neither of them can build buildings. The ones that can build buildings are all of their military units, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. In addition to having the weirdness with the way you actually build structures and gather resources as the Norse, they also don't have a particularly great power lineup for their gods, so unfortunately, they just end up falling to the wayside in favor of the Greeks and Egyptians. You would think that with the changes that the Extended Edition made, they might try to buff up the Norse a bit, but unfortunately they didn't, so the Norse are still pretty much unviable unless you're playing against people who have no idea what they're doing. So when you bring all that together, you end up with the base game being not very well balanced at all, with one faction pretty much being completely unviable, and the other 2 factions having specific combinations of major gods and lesser gods that are going to get used all the time compared to other setups because they're just so much better than the others, along with a hard counter system that actively punishes experimentation as well as forcing you into some pretty tedious slogs of fights if you don't have the right counter units for the situation, as well as a population count system that just doesn't seem very well thought out at all. Then of course you add a couple more problems to the mix, like the unit pathfinding issues the game has, which you'd think they would have fixed the unit pathfinding problems in the Age of Empires series by Age of Mythology, but no, they really didn't. And thus you'll tell your units to go to a specific location, and they'll take the long way around, or they'll go straight through enemy territory, and you'll sit there going, wait, why are you doing that? Sometimes it's not even a very far distance, and they still get lost. It just gets frustrating to deal with. Again, this is a problem with previous Age of Empires games as well, and it certainly wasn't a deal breaker for them, but it's still frustrating that they hadn't fixed it by Age of Mythology, especially with a new engine. And then of course there's the AI, which for higher level RTS players is pretty wimpy, so they don't really pose much of a challenge. And all of that put together makes Age of Mythology on its own, the original game, a pretty underwhelming experience. It's not what I would call an outright bad game, because there is still some good strategy gameplay in there, and if you like the hard counter system, then you'll be all over it. But if, for example, you wanted the actual Age of Empires mechanics with mythological creatures and such in it, then that's actually not what you get here. It makes you wonder if this was meant to be the startup for a new series entirely as opposed to being part of the Age of Empires lineup, but it never got a sequel and it hasn't enjoyed the same kind of longevity that Age of Empires 2 has, so I guess we'll never know. So in summary, the original Age of Mythology, the base game on its own, gets a 2.5 out of 5. Again, it's not an outright bad game, but there is enough wrong with it that they definitely needed to improve things later on. Enter the Titans expansion. This brought quite a bit of new content to the game, including an entire new faction, the Atlanteans, as well as a brand new campaign following the Atlanteans after the events of Age of Mythology. The campaign follows the exploits of Castor as he tries to lead the remnants of the Atlantean people to a new home and tries to help them rebuild. Things get a bit more complicated when they are sitting there thinking that the gods have abandoned them and they end up getting led to a new place to settle, only it wasn't the gods that led them there. It turns out it was actually Kronos, one of the Titans that was imprisoned by Zeus in the Tartarus, that led them there. So the Atlanteans decide to no longer worship the Greek pantheon, but instead try to worship the Titans, and what ensues is quite a lot of bloodshed, because the Greeks see them doing this and like, no, you can't worship the Titans, that's insane, and so they start a war with them, which quickly turns out the Atlanteans are kicking the crap out of them, so they call upon their Egyptian and Norse allies. Once again bringing in the problem of trying to shoehorn all 3 of the pantheons into the same campaign without much rhyme or reason. And what ensues is those 3 armies trying to stop the Atlanteans from bringing the Titans back into the world. And things get a bit more complicated than that as the story progresses, but like in the original Age of Mythology, the story is never particularly great. So it ultimately does fall to the gameplay to bring things up, and that's where things do get a bit interesting, because this introduces the Atlantean civilization, as well as a brand new unit called a Titan. I'll talk a bit about the Titan unit in a moment, but the actual Atlantean civilization still manages to be very different from what you see with the Greeks, Egyptians, and Norse. For one, their gatherer units are kind of a combination of the ox cart and the gatherer or dwarf unit from the Norse, meaning that instead of them having a drop-off point where they pick up their resources and they move to that point, drop them off, then go back to wherever it is, they actually are their own drop-off point. That said, they are also considerably more expensive and considerably slower to produce than all the other gatherer units in the game. So that ultimately ends up balancing out relatively well, but then you find out pretty quickly that they have a weird selection of units. For example, their infantry unit, which is good against cavalry, I might remind you, uses swords and is basically a gladiator. It's fairly strange. And then of course their palace unit is known as a destroyer, and with a name like that you'd think that, oh, they're pretty amazing. But they're only good against buildings. They're pretty much useless against everything else. But something else you find out about the Atlanteans pretty early on is that their units are generally more expensive than all of the others, but they're also more individually powerful, and on top of that, they have the ability to turn all of their human units into heroes, which makes them good against whatever they were already good against, but also good against myth units. This can be an extremely powerful ability, and that's something that you really do remark about the Atlanteans. They are a very powerful civilization, not just in their units themselves, but also in their god powers, several of which can be used more than once, unlike with the other factions. But when you get down to it, they're a quality over quantity kind of civilization, which means that they're probably not going to have as many units as everybody else, even though they are generally a bit more powerful than all the other units. But more importantly, they really need a strong economy going, which is something that the enemy can exploit. So even though a new player might say, oh, well, they're just really overpowered because they have all these units that are so much more powerful than all the others, they do have enough significant downsides that they end up fitting into the balance relatively well. So now, instead of there only being 2 viable civs, at least now there are 3, because unfortunately the expansion didn't really do anything to fix the problems that the Norse had. But they did at least try to fix some of the balancing problems the game had. For example, Set was really overpowered in the original Age of Mythology, so they threw a bunch of tweaks in to nerf him a bit. And they certainly applied some balancing tweaks to all of the other gods as well, so it ultimately ends up making the game a much more enriched experience, because you can go in and it is automatically more balanced than the base game. Well, they do that until you hit the end game, when it introduces the Titans. You see, Titans are the most powerful unit in all of Age of Mythology. You can only build 1 per match, and you require a Titan Gate to do it. You get the Titan Gate by researching the technology The Secrets of the Titans, which is a pretty expensive technology, but by the time you hit the Mythic Age, which is the only time you can do that, then you probably got enough resources built up to where it's not that big of a deal. Once you've researched that technology, you can build a Titan Gate, and once that Titan Gate has been built, it will summon a Titan, which will take out most units with a single hit, and will take out most buildings between 2 to 4 hits. They have an absolutely ridiculous amount of armor and hit points, so they barely take any damage, and even when they do take damage, there's such a high health pool that they're practically indestructible. The only real counter to it is to have a lot of hero units massing against it, and even then, they're still not going to have the easiest time taking it down. This ultimately means that once you hit the Mythic Age, there's really only one effective strategy, which is go for a Titan, because once you summon that Titan, it can go forth to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of the women. And while I do have to admit that it is pretty amusing watching the Titan just crush everything in its path, it does ultimately get pretty old after a while. But here's the thing, if the Titan Gate is destroyed before the Titan is summoned, then there can't be another one built. There's no way of reclaiming the Titan, so there is actually a chance to stop it before it just wreaks havoc on you. Of course, again, this is assuming that you even make it to the Mythic Age, because a lot of games end before they even get to that point. Well, that is if you're going with online play anyway. But apart from the Titans pretty much ruining Mythic Age strategy, the rest of the expansion is actually quite good. It's what an expansion pack should be. It adds quite a bit of new content that is clearly different from what we had before, and it tweaks a lot of the elements from the base game in order to make them better balanced. But it still doesn't fix a few fundamental problems, and with the addition of the Titans, it also brings some issues of its own, which were never really fixed. Ultimately, that means that this is simply a good expansion pack. It's not great, it's just good as far as expansion packs go. It adds a good amount of content, and it's generally a pretty good value for money if you already liked the base game. Ultimately, I end up giving the expansion pack itself, on its own, a 3.5 out of 5. Again, it's a good expansion, not a great one. Which leads me into a point that I need to make about the base game with its expansion pack only, which is that when you combine the two, ultimately what you end up with is a 3 out of 5. Again, I can't personally stand it, but I recognize that it's at least a decent real-time strategy game. But there's simply too much wrong with it for it to be anything higher than a 3 out of 5, even when you combine it together with the expansion pack, and even when you combine it with the enhancements from the extended edition, where it improves some of the visuals, and of course it brings up to modern resolutions, and you don't have to go through ESO anymore. But the extended edition came with its own issues here and there, mostly just technical problems that they eventually ironed out, so there's not really anything wrong with the extended edition anymore. And I could say that if you can get the extended edition for cheap, then it's a maybe, but again, I can't personally stand it, which means that I personally can't recommend it either. But then there's the final expansion pack thus far, which was only released for the extended edition. In addition to introducing an entirely new faction, the Chinese, it also introduces a new campaign. This time from a completely different perspective than what we saw in the previous two campaigns, this one being it takes place in China and they're observing as chaos is erupting in the world and are trying to restore balance. And you'll notice right from the get-go that it doesn't have the same kind of problem that the previous two campaigns I've talked about did, which is that it doesn't try to shoehorn in all of the other mythologies. It only focuses on Chinese mythology. So at least the developers of the expansion pack learned from that one mistake that the previous two campaigns had. But here's the thing, it's not the same team that worked on this. This is a completely different team trying to put together a brand new expansion pack for a game that was over a decade old when they were making the expansion. And you know what? If this were simply a mod that was available for free, then I would say that the campaign is actually fairly admirable because it does have full cutscenes and it also has full voice acting. The problem is that it was very haphazardly slapped together. I mean, there's a relatively decent variety of things to do during the campaign, but the actual writing is very low quality, even compared to the previous two expansions, and you end up just not really giving much of a crap about what's going on, particularly if you try to play through the first mission, which is incredibly dull. It has you repairing a dam, which takes absolutely forever because there are 8 points on the dam that you need to repair, and each of them has an absolutely ridiculous amount of hit points and takes a ridiculous amount of time to repair. This means that the mission just drags on and on and on because it's not a particularly difficult mission or anything. I mean, the only real threat that's ever going to come up against you is a bunch of lizards that will attack on occasion, but those are fairly easy to deal with. So when they start the campaign off on tedium, that's not really a good sign. Thankfully, the rest of the campaign's not quite as bad, but then the ending happens and you sit there just staring at your screen going, wait, was that it? That's all we get? It's not even really much of an ending. The campaign just ends up being considerably weaker than both of its predecessors, and it ultimately really falls to the gameplay to bring things up. And that's where the expansion pretty much collapses in on itself, because the Chinese faction in this game is not much more than a reskin. While the previous 4 civilizations sometimes had similar playstyles but were very noticeably different, you don't get that feeling when you're playing as the Chinese, because they're really just a combination of elements from the previous 4 civilizations, and in some cases their units are straight up reskins. Not to mention, when the expansion pack originally launched, it was horrendously unbalanced. I mean, the Chinese were stupidly overpowered with their vermilion birds, which are still very powerful units, but they've been toned down a bit since then. The expansion also came with a litany of glitches, most of which have thankfully been patched out, but some of which are still there, and between the general lack of balancing and the lack of new content other than the campaign and the new faction, it just ends up being a crappy expansion pack that doesn't really add anything worthwhile to the game. Which is a real shame because Chinese mythology is interesting and it would make for some pretty cool faction gameplay if they had actually put effort into making the faction interesting. Instead, they took the lazy route and just said, we're just going to make a general amalgam of previous factions and call it a day, and that just doesn't work very well. The whole expansion just ends up feeling like a crappy mod more than anything else, and that's just frankly insulting given that they are charging money for this. And the worst part is, when you compare it to what happened with Age of Empires 2 HD, where they've released 3 new expansion packs for it since the release of the HD version, and all 3 of those were actually good solid additions to Age of Empires 2 as opposed to being cheap cash grabs like the Tale of the Dragon expansion, it just makes the situation with Age of Mythology that much more depressing. Because when you get down to it, the Tale of the Dragon expansion is a 1.5 out of 5. It's a piece of crap expansion that is not worth getting at all, even if you do like Age of Mythology and the Titans already. Luckily, they still give you the option of getting the extended edition on its own as opposed to having to get Tale of the Dragon along with it, so if you want to avoid the Tale of the Dragon expansion, you certainly can. But that still doesn't change the fact that the expansion is a pretty low quality cash grab, and that's frankly just insulting. So there you have it, folks, my review of Age of Mythology with both of its expansion packs. Sorry it took me so long to get this video out. I fully intended on getting this review done for Saturday, but unfortunately I just ran out of time, and by the time I did have time to work on it, I was too tired to work on it. So unfortunately it ended up getting pushed back way longer than I thought it would. Now that said, the next review should be on schedule, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.